Mighty man and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع. أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the official first show of the new year, 2024. And I'm coming to you just before 8 o'clock British time on the 2nd of January 2024. And tonight we're going to be covering the irrationality of bourgeois politics, viewed via some of the analysis done by the great Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, with particular reference to his views on the state. So, we will say, first of all, good evening to those who are in the chat. So, good evening to Peter in Perfidious Albion, Lee, Martin, who's working from home. I'll emphasize rather than put the scare quotes. Good evening to Carmo out there on the Wirral, and Jay in Virginia, and my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project, who, I don't know whether it was you, Jason, who put out the tweet from the project's Twitter account celebrating the achievements of Trotskyism, but you certainly triggered whoever it was that's running the Left Unity account these days. Though, interestingly enough, the only achievements of Trotskyism that the offended party could find were actually achievements of the Bolshevik Party as a collective. The achievements of Trotskyism remained blank. So, with that in mind, let us proceed. Now, before I get to the irrationality of bourgeois politics, I'll first pause to say hello to Rob and Dodolk. And yes, Jason was the man who baited British Trotskyism. So, hello to Yep X as well. So, before we get underway with the discussion of American bourgeois politics, let us just pause to note that the Israelis conducted an assassination operation in Lebanon today, and they bombed an area of Beirut for the specific purpose of assassinating a man named Abu Ammar, or al-Awruri, along with several others who are senior members and senior officers, basically, with the Al-Qassam brigades in Lebanon. So the Israelis can't seem to kill any of the senior Al-Qassam brigades or any of the other senior commanders of the unified Palestinian National Liberation Forces in Gaza. They can't seem to hit them there. So they've gone after basically any target they could find. So the representatives of the Al-Qassam brigades in Lebanon is their target. So I will first of all just say, or give my thoughts on why this is happening. Now, it is my view that the reason why this is happening is nothing to do with Israeli genius or master plan, or never mind strength. It's a desperation move, because they are now having to acknowledge, even their own senior officials or former senior officials, like Dan Halutz, former Israeli Armed Forces Chief, the General Staff, has admitted that they're failing and have failed in Gaza. Hassan Nasrallah has been proven correct. They haven't met any of their objectives, nor are they going to. They can't defeat Hamas. They can't defeat, I should say, the Palestinian National Liberation Forces. Their target isn't even really to do that anymore. Their actual aim is to inflict as much death and terror on the Palestinian population that they either flee, which isn't happening, or they reject Hamas, or they can be terrorized out of supporting the cause of Palestinian national liberation. Now, that didn't work for the French in Algeria, and it didn't work for the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it didn't work for the Nazis in the Soviet Union or in Yugoslavia. So it's not going to work for the Zionists in occupied Palestine now. It just isn't. The way in which this has evolved has confirmed two things. One, the weakness of the Israelis in terms of their ability to actually conduct a military campaign. The Israeli army isn't any good. I say that, of course, as somebody who's no conventional military experience. But just from an amateur's perspective, just from having read a fair bit of military history and military theory, and having observed the war between Russia and NATO in Ukraine for the last year, you can see how the Russian army, or even the NATO-organized Ukrainian army, conducts itself in terms of its ability to fight. You compare that to the Israelis, and the Israelis are garbage. They can't fight the Palestinian National Liberation Forces. The only thing the Israeli army is good at is brutalizing civilians, raping women, and stealing organs from dead bodies. That's about it. So they're losing the war. When called upon to fight, they can't. As we've mentioned before, all this footage you're seeing of the Palestinian forces being able to sneak up to a Merkava tank, place some kind of explosive device on the tank, run away, then hit it with multiple missiles, anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and not knock it out, all happens because the Israelis don't have infantry screening the tank. They don't have anybody around it. All the Israeli forces are too terrified to get out of their armored vehicles, so they sit there hiding. And so the Palestinians, with some incredibly brave men taking on these duties, run up, place the bag of bombs on it, run away, hit it with a few missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, or some combination of the two, and knock out a very expensive piece of equipment, turning it into a heavy metal tomb for the tank crew. And then you see all the other footage that the Palestinian fighters put out, and it includes some ludicrous things, like you see these Israelis standing out just in a bombed out house, and they're all taking selfies. You can see these idiots holding up their phones, like taking videos of themselves. And the Palestinians just wait, then fire off a load of rocket-propelled grenades at them, killing loads of them. And you wonder, like, what the hell is wrong with these guys? Like, if you were in that situation, knowing that you were facing an enemy that knows every square inch of the ground and has been ambushing you with a high degree of success, and yet you're so stupid and ill-disciplined that you're hanging around taking a selfie, doing a video for TikTok. I mean, these guys are useless, it would seem, completely useless, being hammered every time they step out of their tanks and killed even in their tanks. So they're losing the war. They've already, strategically speaking, lost it. They declared that they were fighting for objectives which, in terms of destroying Hamas, they can't possibly achieve. The objectives were declared not for the purposes of attaining them, but for the purposes of looking good in terms of media optics. That's why Netanyahu said what he said. That's why he said, we're going to defeat and destroy Hamas. He said it to look good, to solidify his position. Now he's looking weaker than ever. And now the divisions within the Israeli political system are glaringly obvious. And so they've done this to try and look as if they're hitting something that matters to the Palestinian National Liberation Forces. I doubt that this will make much of a difference at all. The reason why they were able to kill these guys is that clearly the security systems that they have in place for their leadership in Gaza are far superior to what they have in place in Lebanon. And it's very doubtful that these guys had any influence over what's going on in Gaza anyway. So it's a sign of weakness, a sign of failure. I know that Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has delayed a speech he was scheduled to give tomorrow. I doubt that it's going to lead to any kind of major escalation, though, because Hezbollah clearly it has a plan that they are coordinating with the Palestinians and the wider regional-based resistance movements in Iraq and in Yemen, with the working towards the plan, or the objective, I should say, that was outlined by Nasrallah early on in this campaign, which is that the Palestinian national liberation struggle is at the center of this, but there's the wider struggle, of which the Palestinians are in the vanguard of, which is to free the region in terms of freeing Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and other nations from American imperialist domination. That's the plan that they're working towards. And they've factored into that the Israelis and the Americans are going to bomb and kill their leaders wherever they can. But I doubt that they will let this provoke them into some kind of wider war that they haven't calculated for. They will continue to exert pressure on Israel without probably going to full-scale war. They've already tied down almost half the Israeli armed forces in the northern part of occupied Palestine without even going into open warfare just yet. So they will continue to act as they have done and continue to tie the Israelis down to the point where the Israelis are in serious trouble. Their economy is bleeding. The Yemeni naval blockade on the port of Eilat is draining the Israeli shipping industry to the point where it has been bled white. The Israeli economy is crashing. The Israeli political system is becoming more and more unstable. The American imperialists are suffering severe diplomatic repercussions because of their stance supporting the Israeli mass murder, which Biden calculated was going to be over in a couple of months and that it was all going to be wrapped up. Now it's dragging on. Israel is losing and Biden's bleeding support all over the place and nobody knows what to do. So this assassination campaign should be seen as, again, the part of a lashing out caused by weakness. They can't win in Gaza. They're trying to find something else elsewhere that enables them to present some sort of victory. Netanyahu's running the war in a similar way to the way that Zelensky does the acting part of the Ukraine war. It's all based on presenting an image of strength and certainty, whereas, of course, the reality is anything but. So, more on this tomorrow, I think. We'll come back to it, but that's all I want to say on it for now. Comments from the forum. Martin says, somebody tell Cy Hersh. Well, Cy Hersh has been wrong about a number of things in recent weeks. If I had the time, I would go back over some of his older reporting to see if this followed a certain pattern. Because as with the story that he ran about Gerasimov holding ceasefire talks with Zaluzny, it's clear that Hersh is used by certain people within the American security and military establishment to float stories that they want to see gain traction. And when Hersh did that story, it coincided with stories in other American bourgeois press outlets about about the fact that the Russians are seeking a negotiated settlement, that Putin wants out, basically, which isn't true. And not just Putin, but everybody who has commented on this, including Medvedev, former Russian president, has said that this is going to be a war that continues and will end on their terms. So it's plain that Hersh is used for leaking things that the American political establishment, or some of them at least, want to get out there and want to gain traction. And that, for that reason, I don't trust his reporting anymore. I don't trust it any more than I would a story in the New York Times, even if I agreed with the point. And I say that because I've just seen a comment from President Jesus in the chat who says, do I still trust Hersh's reporting on Nord Stream? I didn't trust it at the time, to be honest. I had a conversation with somebody offline who will remain nameless at this stage, who knows about these things. What that person was telling me was that this story doesn't seem real, that it's very doubtful that, to my mind anyway, that the Americans would risk getting their hands dirty in a direct assault on a Russian asset, not when they can get other people, namely the British, to do the dirty work for them. It's not that the Americans are particularly, ethical about these things, but the people who run the American imperial state, many of them are not, of course, completely insane or anything like that. They are, of course, people who are aggressive imperialists. It is very true, but these are people who have a certain need to be in touch with reality, and they know that they have to keep some kind of dialogue open with the government of the Russian Federation. Now, yes, it is true that there are many in the American state machine who wanted to take out the Nord Stream pipeline. They said this over and over again. However, there's a difference between wanting to take it out and actually doing it. And again, why would the US imperialists do it themselves, directly getting their hands dirty, when you can get the British to do it for you? If you look back at the way in which the British have deployed their dubious strengths over the course of the war in Ukraine, the Nord Stream attack fits directly with something that the British would do. First of all, the British still have the capacity to do underwater sabotage operations. They have the capacity within the Navy and within the perhaps the special boat service, like the aquatic version of the SAS. But certainly the British Navy has the capability of carrying out this kind of sabotage operation. Second of all, if you look back on the interview I did with Kit Clarenberg back in, I believe it was August or September of last year, or earlier, in fact, when the first bombing of the Hersh Bridge occurred, his reporting into the British role in the war, in my view, should be receive far more of a high profile than what Hersh has come out with, because Kit Clarenberg put together that the British were running like a special operations and sabotage unit, that they were coordinating the actions of the terroristic operations of the Ukrainians were being run by MI6 and other British military and intelligence assets. The British are running this whole campaign in the Black Sea directed against Russian naval assets. So the British were the most likely to be the fall guys for this. They were the ones who the Americans entrusted it to. They were the ones who would have wanted to do it because they have the capability to do it. And these kind of special operations, intelligence work, sabotage work, are the kind of things that the British Navy can still do successfully. So why on earth would Joe Biden and the Americans be stupid enough to implicate themselves when they can get the Brits to do it for them? Will Johnson in the chat notes that George Eliasson concluded it was the British Navy training Ukrainians. Maybe the Ukrainians were involved in it, but I would say it was the Brits directly. I think maybe they tried to train up the Ukrainians, but my guesswork is that it takes a lot of expertise to plant enough explosives on this pipeline to blow it up and successfully carry out that operation. I think it was done by British personnel directly. And as someone else says in the chat, Lee says in the chat, Liz Truss texted I think it was Blinken, immediately after this pipeline was blown up, saying it's done. Look, this was done, I think, by the British. I don't know why Hersh was given that story that it was Biden. I think that it was probably done by one of Biden and Blinken's many political enemies inside the U.S. state in order to pin the blame on them. But yes, it was ultimately the U.S. benefited from it, but the people who did it was the British who did it. So Hersh, I would now regard as an unreliable source, to say the least. Right. Irish Partisan says, I see the Communist Party of Britain have gone into their standard vote, put pressure on Labour to shift them left, judging from the latest editorial in the Morning Star. Yeah, I've just called that up. I haven't had time to read it as yet. If I read that now, it's going to derail the whole stream. So I think what I will do is I'll cover that tomorrow. It looks abysmal, though. And it's the same line they've been pushing in every election since 1951. So I'm not surprised that they haven't changed now. But I'm gonna cover that tomorrow, I think. Tonight, I wanted to go on to mention the strange and crazy world of bourgeois American politics, and particularly with the attempt at kicking Trump off the ballot in Colorado and Maine, I believe. And of course, this is going to be challenged by Trump's lawyers in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, and this may well get struck down. But I think it's worth just pausing for a moment to analyze, well, why is it that the US state machine is behaving so fundamentally irrationally about Trump? Because Trump has never shown the slightest inclination to actually seriously challenge any of the key priorities of American imperialism. In fact, he's been an enthusiastic participant of various schemes that the most extreme elements in the American state have come up with. So why is it that after his win in 2016, large elements of the U.S. state bureaucracy remain hysterically hostile to him, even though he's done really nothing to justify that? Now, to understand why, I think you have to go back to looking at the way in which the bourgeois state has changed in the era of imperialism. And what I mean by this is that in the era of imperialism, which for the United States starts in the 1890s with the starting of their imperialist campaigns to take land off the decaying and declining Spanish Empire, so the Spanish-American War, conquest of Cuba and Philippines and other places, and the movement of the starting point for American imperialism, moving from an industrial capitalist system into the imperialist system. So what does the imperialist system bring with it, though? Well, as Lenin observed in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, imperialism brings with it a certain amount of bureaucratization, moving from a system where much of it, although by no means all of it, was run by individual capitalists. So you have individual capitalists whose names become very famous, such as Carnegie, such as J.P. Morgan and others, Rockefeller, etc. And you have a change where you move from a system where it's individual capitalists who are the guys with their names above the door to a system run by financial capitalism, so the merging of industrial and money capital. And this also means a move from individual ownership or majority individual ownership to ownership by stock and ownership by the holding of stock, which means it goes from something which is largely owned and controlled by one individual or one family to being owned by a broader section of shareholding capitalists. And it is the move to the shareholder model of ownership, which doesn't mean that there isn't a capitalist class anymore. It's just a capitalist class with interests in numerous different holdings, rather than being all invested in one particular area. It's now invested across the board in multiple different industries. As capitalism changes, so does some of the ownership patterns. But what that means for the state is that this move to imperialism in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere coincides with the bureaucratization of capitalism, of course, goes hand in hand with the bureaucratization of the state. Now, when I say a bureaucratization of the state, what do I mean? But by the time you get to the imperialist period, the various advanced capitalist nations have had to make numerous concessions to the working class in terms of extension of certain democratic rights. And this has necessitated in the from the capitalist class a move to take decision making away from areas away from areas where there is working class political representation and towards a more bureaucratic form of decision making. And I'll give a solid example as to this. In British terms, there used to be a much more democratic system of managing the police forces in the country. Used to be that there were elected police boards in and around Britain, and these were exercising a relative degree of control over local police forces. Now, when the working class obtained the vote, the bourgeoisie began the process of stripping all elected bodies of their power to monitor the police forces. They started centralizing control over the police forces that had previously been quite localized and had a degree of local control over them, and started centralizing them through the ministry known as the Home Office. So that was done in order to minimize any impact that the extension of the franchise to the entire working class could have over the control of the forces of the state. That's one example. The other examples would be how more and more decisions were made via backroom deals, went from being debated in Congress to being done via a bureaucratic system, to being done by government agencies which were only subject to congressional oversight in the United States via the appointment of the head of a particular organization. So, in other words, basically making it so that the decisions over key things were taken inside bureaucracies that were only subject to scrutiny at the top level every so often. So you remove any potential for the democratic concessions that have been made to the working class of getting in the way of crucial business of the bourgeoisie, that they need to conduct that business out of the way of any potential scrutiny and just get the decisions made quickly and efficiently. It's also part of the reason why the Federal Reserve has so much power in the United States and the Bank of England has so much power here. The politicians, bourgeois politicians, have over the years devolved more and more power into the central banks precisely because they want that they want the central banks to have the ability to inject liquidity into the economy rapidly and with no potential barrier to them doing so. So they want to be able to be in a position whereby the central bank can immediately, at very short notice, pump liquidity into the system with no barrier to that, not even in the form of like a sort of rogue American libertarian, like a Ron Paul figure, being able to get in the way. So the development of imperialism as a system goes hand in hand with a elimination of any potential, even the mildest of bourgeois democratic constraints upon the governmental system. That's the nature of the governance structure, shall we say. That's the nature of the imperialist state. It's one where the democratic reforms that have been granted to the working class since the 19th century have, as soon as they have been given, the bourgeoisie have sought to circumvent them, just with as with anything else. As with, if you examine the history of working classes winning a pay rise through industrial struggle, as soon as they win the pay rise, the bourgeoisie seeks to circumvent that, to cancel it out, to restore the profitability that has been damaged by the awarding of pay rises to the working class. Same as they do on the economic front, same as they do the same on the political front. Every single democratic concession that's ever been made, the bourgeoisie immediately moves to cancel it out. And this is especially true in the era of imperialism. Because in the era of imperialism, particularly this form of late-stage imperialism, the capitalist system actually becomes more and more unstable. It becomes, the rate of profit goes down. The need to prop up the system via the injection of vast amounts of liquidity increases. The need to continually do this since 2008 has very much increased. And also, as we get into the period of late capitalism, the period we are sitting within right now, of decaying imperialism, you also have, of course, the fact that the bourgeoisie see themselves, quite correctly, as having won a victory in the class war with the collapse of official socialism in the early 1990s and the assault that the American bourgeois carried out on the American working class movement. In my view, and I have expressed this on numerous occasions, this assault on the American working class movement begins around about 1947 with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act and then the systematic victimization and blacklisting of communists and other working class, what Gramsci would call the organic intellectuals of the working class. What HUAC, or House Un-American Activities Committee, known as McCarthyism, but really it was about far more than him. It was the entire political system of the United States was devoted from the immediate period at the end of World War II onwards to uprooting the organic intellectuals of the working class from their places in American industry and American public and intellectual life, and making sure that that layer is extirpated, that these people are removed from their jobs, removed from any position they had whereby they could have an influence over the working class, and with the American Communist Party is busted up to the point where it can no longer have the close connection with the working class that it did have in the 30s and 40s. And so it's a counter-revolutionary move that begins in the 40s and runs continually through to the 1990s, that seeks to reverse the gains of the American worker. So the way in which you have to see this period of American political development is that after 1991, the American bourgeois, drunk on a fake victory, they thought that they'd won a victory against the Soviet Union. In actual fact, they'd been the beneficiaries of a counter-revolutionary process, which they had something to do with, but not as much as they thought. They believed that they had won. They believed that there was no need to have any concessions made to the American worker anymore. Therefore, they could seek to minimize as much as they possibly could any democratic concessions that had been made in previous eras. And so from the early 90s, you have a relentless drive in the United States to make sure that there was no possibility of any working class breakthrough ever again. And this isn't just about a breakthrough of like a communist party or something like that. It's also about the breakthrough of any rogue elements that might destabilize the system. So in '92, you had a rogue capitalist, Ross Perot, burst through using his own money to essentially boost his profile and barge his way into the debates of the election of 1992, where he actually did pretty well and made Clinton and Bush look pretty stupid. He didn't win after a bizarre period where he dropped out, or a lot of speculation as to why he did. But they tightened up the regulations on who got access to the debates after that to make sure that Perot couldn't ambush them again. And they relentlessly, through the 1990s and into the 2000s, you find that control exercised by the party machines, not just in the United States, but Britain as well, was dedicated towards making sure that there were no rogue elements within the system at all. The system could just about tolerate a Ron Paul, as long as he was on his own. They could tolerate useless figures such as Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, or John McDonnell or others, as long as they remained isolated and stuck in a sort of stagnant pool on the left of the Labour Party. Now, what this system couldn't tolerate, especially as it moves into crisis, is the idea or the reality that these people like Corbyn on the left, or Sanders on the left, or Trump, who were meant to be certainly Sanders and Corbyn on the left were meant to provide a fake option. They were meant to provide the illusion that there could be choice within the system, and there was never meant to be any more than, say, one or two of them. Now, they were never meant to break through and threaten to win power, which both of them did threaten to do for at least a little while. Certainly Corbyn did. And the fact that the people who you put up as a fake alternative only remain a fake alternative as long as they never stand any chance of actually getting near power. They're not meant to get near power. And so Trump, who was promoted, as we all know by now, by the Clinton campaign as this sort of he was going to be a sort of fake alternative. He was going to be a repository for discontent, but he was also going to be held up as a ludicrous figure who nobody could take seriously. And this was going to be what opposition to the system was presented as. It's a very old tactic. It's the same tactic that they used to a more extreme degree in the so-called War on Terror, where it was portrayed by the bourgeois press as all opposition to the system as it stood could only be expressed or was all about essentially being you were a jihadist sympathizer. The way in which the bourgeois press constructed the narrative in the 2000s was that well, you're either with the great inspirational bourgeois leaders, or you're with the terrorists. This was a line that they repeated over and over again. You're a terrorist sympathizer. You're an Al-Qaeda sympathizer. If you oppose what we're doing in Iraq, then you're with, take your pick. Al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein, name a villain of the week. And so the whole point of that is to paint any opposition to the established order as being outside of acceptability. It's not just a difference of opinion, it's that you are now essentially a terrorist. And that's the way they wanted to use Trump, of course. They wanted to use him as the magnet for opposition, and therefore you discredit any and all opposition by having it associated with him. Now, that's the role he was supposed to play. He was supposed to stand up there, say ludicrous things, and get thrashed by Hillary Clinton. The fact that Hillary Clinton couldn't beat him, and he ended up winning, of course, sent them insane. They couldn't very well admit that their system had become so decayed and so corroded that the loyalty of the population to it had completely decayed and corroded, and that they couldn't mobilize anybody in support of it anymore, or at least not in a serious way. And the fact was that Trump had managed to pull off this victory that he did, sent many of them into paroxysms of wild despair, which is because for many of them, they'd convinced themselves that they were genuinely in the end of history and that there would be no alternative anymore, to quote Margaret Thatcher, and that there would be no breaking away from what you might call the dead center, the various different forms of very elitist liberalism that exist in the United States and Britain. Because there was never meant to be any, even the remotest amount of democratic participation in the system. And Trump, again, in his own way, it represents a danger because he is not like the other Republican candidates that have stood in the 21st century for president. He's not like George W. Bush or John McCain or Mitt Romney, all of whom were party men. They were men dependent upon the networks of the Republican Party, the funding structures of the Republican Party. Trump, because he was hugely famous outside of politics before he ran for the Republican nomination, because he had a degree of name recognition and was able to generate a donor base that wasn't just dependent upon, again, those funding channels that were controlled by the Republican Party, he represents a threat, not because of anything he actually did. He never seriously threatened American imperialism. But the fact that he has a base of petty bourgeois, some workers, but also national or regional American capitalists. So not like the big-time shareholder Wall Street guys, but maybe the next layer below or the layer below them. A lot of them are enthusiasts for Trump. The Make America Great Again branding very much appealed to some of the more nationally based capitalists, those who feel or indeed are excluded from the toppermost layers of American capitalism, those who maybe have national capitalist interest or indeed regional capitalist interest inside some of the American states, or confined to just one or two sections of the American states. And this lower layer of the capitalist class in the United States, as with any lower layer of the capitalist class or upper layer of the petty bourgeois, always hates and despises the toppermost layers of the bourgeoisie, because the topmost layers of the bourgeoisie dominate the system and are always on the point of running this layer out of business, absorbing their business and buying them up. And so that's the kind of people who were attracted towards Trump. But they're people with a little bit of money, and they're able to mobilize for Trump, and they're able to act as a pretty solid donor base for him. And for those reasons, that's regarded as a threat. You see, what the post-1991 politician is supposed to be like in the United States is essentially like a Mitt Romney or a Barack Obama or a George W. Bush, which is that, especially with Obama, was the ideal bourgeois politician for this particular age. But what perhaps the model for it, the prototype for it, was Clinton, Jeffrey's friend. I never knew no Jeffrey Epstein, because what you need, if you're a bourgeois, is somebody who can act the part of the president or a congressman or a senator on television, who can look the part, but one who has no connection to the American masses whatsoever, who is completely dependent upon the party and the American capitalist class for funding of their campaigns, who doesn't have an independent donor base, who isn't able to fund their campaigns for office independently. And so therefore, due to the fact they are completely hardwired into the systems controlled by the capitalist class, they are wholly and owned and controlled by the capitalist class. They have no ability, or very little ability, to go rogue. There's very little chance of them going rogue. They're completely controlled by the capitalist class. Now, what makes a Trump or even a Sanders, who's a completely compromised figure and always was, more of a worry is that they're not dependent upon those networks. That's what made them worried about Sanders. Sanders is no threat to American imperialism. He's been pro-imperialist for a very long time, as noted by his old friend, former friend, Michael Parenti. But the fact that he could generate enough of a connection with the American masses, no matter how flawed we might regard the politics of these people as being, the fact that Trump can have some kind of mass base of support that's not purely dependent upon the traditional networks of the Republican Party, all of that represents a threat. And all that represents a threat because it means that these guys aren't as completely controlled as like a Clinton and Obama or a George W. Bush or a Mitt Romney. And even the slightest risk of what the bourgeois would derisively refer to as populism has to be vigorously crushed. Why? Because the system itself is incredibly unstable. The system is incredibly unstable because, of course, we've got to the point where profitability is very low, where the American capitalist class is drowning in debt, where any change to the economic policies that have been pursued pretty much consistently since Obama threatens the stability of the system, where they need to keep the liquidity being pumped in, even if they've cut back on quantitative easing. There's other ways in which they routinely turn quantitative easing back on, the Federal Reserve does, whenever things look to get a bit wobbly. So any deviation from that, the slightest hint that things might go in a different direction, all of that is too much risk for the capitalist class to bear. So even a figure that's ludicrous, like Trump is, who never really seriously intended to challenge anything, represents a certain threat to that. Again, he never intended to be, but then again, he was never meant to be in charge. So now you have a situation where the American bourgeois is becoming more and more irrational. They went mad when he got into power. Rather than do the sensible thing of just trying to constrain him, they tried to, essentially, they found that they could revive interest or enthusiasm for their own parties by whipping up the petty bourgeois leftist base of the Democratic Party and the wider petty bourgeois layers in the United States into a frenzy about Trump, which is part of what the whole Russiagate thing was about, and other things as well, like even things that Trump was doing that Obama had done before him, like the whole kids in cages thing. The kids in cages that policy started under Obama, and the Democrats didn't say shit about it. Trump carries it on, and suddenly it's the next stage of the Holocaust. Like, the policy is bad and cruel and unjust, no matter who carries it out, but suddenly you want to whip up everybody into a storm about every single thing that Trump does. You declare, that Cheeto Franco is caging children, and then AOC goes and dresses in white and cries on a fence somewhere that's nowhere near any actual caged children, of course. So the American bourgeois political system found that it could try and mobilize people and perhaps try and re-legitimate the system, which was undergoing a crisis of legitimacy, by mobilizing more petty bourgeois against Trump. That's why, of course, the American bourgeois, or some of them at least, those aligned with the Democrats, enthusiastically got on board with Black Lives Matter and other things, because they saw in Black Lives Matter, which of course started excuse me, which of course started from a very real place. It starts from a very real place in that the brutalization and done by the the U.S. cops against the black working class population was a very real thing. And militarization of the police since the 1970s, really, in the United States, is, of course, a very real thing. But what is done with that is, of course, very cynical from bourgeois political forces. What they seek to do is, of course, utilize the groundswell of popular support and enthusiasm that the Black Lives Matter movement had generated and turn that into a force that can re-legitimize or re-energize particularly the Democratic Party, or more broadly speaking, the establishment sections of both parties. So remember Mitt Romney going on a Black Lives Matter march? How many whites-only country clubs do you think he's been a member of over the years? I'm willing to bet it's quite a few. How many do you think he's still a member of now? So this was used and it was encouraged by the bourgeois in 2020. It was encouraged as a destabilization operation. There's no two ways about that. And remember, distinguish between the cause or the origin of this, which is legitimate rage against the militarized nature and the deeply racist nature and the deeply class-based nature of American policing, which is that the American militarized police forces are used as weapons of terror to brutalize working class communities in the United States. They act in similar ways in poorer working class white and Hispanic areas as they do in the poorer working class black American areas as well. So this is militarized, class-based, racialist policing that causes this. And the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement gets easily taken over by essentially the Democratic Party and ends up being led by these very corrupt individuals who are now all using BLM funds to purchase properties for themselves. That's all a deliberate design. Because what you want to do if you're a bourgeois political organizer for the Democratic Party is channel all of that energy into being simply an anti-Trump thing. And then you can use that to say, hey, well, I just want to get rid of Trump. Got to get rid of that Trump, right? Trump. Got to get rid of Cheeto Franco. So you better vote for Joe Biden. You know, Strom Thurmond's old friend. So the way in which you see a real movement, an organic movement that arose spontaneously, be co-opted and then destroyed by the American ruling class is instructive, because bourgeois politics, as noted by Gramsci noted in The State and Civil Society, that the state and its associated elements, including the political parties, are the earthworks that defend the capitalist system. So bourgeois politics needs to make sure that its party system is kept vital, is kept revived. And the period after the Obama ascendancy threatened to delegitimize and destroy the Democratic Party, because, of course, Obama is an ideal bourgeois politician in many respects because he whipped up a lot of expectations but then let them down very quickly. And what the bourgeois hope is, of course, that if they whip up expectations, they get demoralized quickly, as the politician in question proves to be a dedicated servant of imperialism. And then these demoralized people will just go away. But of course it doesn't. As with everything else the bourgeois do, they gain a temporary victory by elevating an Obama-type figure. They revive expectations in the system and therefore avert a potential crisis in 2008 by pushing the discontent into a vote for a safe and controlled establishment figure who had branded himself, had packaged himself as a sort of generic pseudo-type radical. People painted onto him anything they wanted to, and that was quite deliberate in the way that he was constructed. So what the bourgeois do is they avoid an immediate crisis that could have threatened the system by channeling the discontent of American workers towards a vote for Obama. They then, of course, hope to just let the air out of those tires and hope that the energy that escapes as this happens, the energy that is crushed, that goes nowhere, that the demoralization works on a permanent basis. But of course it doesn't, because then enough of the population who voted for Obama then moves to do things like Occupy Wall Street, which again necessitates a response from the defense systems of the American imperialist state. So you get the move into Occupy of many people who would have been Obama enthusiasts in 2007, 2008. And so that necessitates another change from the managers of the American system. First of all, it means direct state repression. So direct state repression was used to destroy the Occupy movement. Let us never forget that. But also, then you get the attempted manipulation. So they didn't anticipate the Sanders thing. They didn't anticipate, and he didn't anticipate, that is Sanders, that he would gain the level of popularity that he did. Then he needed to be crushed. And of course, you can rely on good old Bernie to sell out in return for a pat on the head from the bourgeois, which he did. But then again, that leads to more discontent. So that leads to their chosen candidate, Hillary Clinton, not winning, or it's partially what led to it. Then they need to try and revive interest in their parties again. So they co-opt Black Lives Matter. Again, another short-term attempted solution to a deep and long-running crisis of legitimacy, which helps gain them a temporary victory over Trump. You can argue about how the legitimacy and fairness of that election. Personally, I think that most American bourgeois elections are rigged one way or another. The Democrats rig them sometimes successfully. The Republicans rig them sometimes successfully. If you think that an election in a bourgeois state is free and fair, then you're reading a book of fairy tales. So every time they turn, and every time they try and push oppositional energy into some other direction to absorb it and to demoralize it, then all it does for them is create another bigger crisis down the road. So now it's like the old nursery rhyme, the old woman who swallows a spider to catch a fly. The bourgeois funnel discontent into various different avenues to try and get themselves out of another crisis. They can't get themselves fully out of the crisis, of course, though, because the crisis is rooted in the deep and long-running crisis of American imperialism, which is now a crisis which has manifested itself 15 years ago on one level, but perhaps 50 years ago, or 60 years ago almost now, mid-1960s, when it really started to accelerate. So every time they think they've found a different strategy to manage this away, all that does is create more contradictions and antagonisms, which is what Trump represents. Trump was supposed to be a ludicrous figure who said like outrageous right-wing things, and therefore all Hillary Clinton would need to do is to stand there and go, "How dare you, sir? You're a racist," and everybody would rally behind Hillary. You have insulted our great leader, Barack Obama. You have done this and that or the other. That's why Trump was promoted. But of course, what they failed to realize was that their own legitimacy had collapsed to the point where you could call Trump a racist and a buffoon and orange Hitler, and it wouldn't matter anymore because people were so sick and tired of Hillary fucking Clinton and various other characters that were being promoted by the state managers in the United States that Trump would just absorb all the stuff they threw at him and it wouldn't affect him. So now Trump, who was meant to be the way in which Hillary Clinton was going to get boosted and the way that her popularity was going to be bolstered, turned out to be deadly for that. And now, of course, even though he continues to commit himself to conventional bourgeois politics in so many ways, the fact that people in the United States are grafting onto him the image of oppositionism, and the fact that the American bourgeois has no real answer to him now. They have no real answer to his popularity, because that would they would need to radicalize the situation further, and they don't want to do that. They were prepared to indulge Black Lives Matter to get rid of Trump. Now that's been destroyed. They've driven that into the ground and destroyed its credibility. Something else will emerge. And now they're stuck with Trump and Biden, neither of which are good choices for them. Biden is demented and is going down the tubes. Trump, they don't trust, because, again, it's not because of anything he's done. It's because if he's beholden to anything, he's beholden to his base of smaller capitalists, the MAGA crowd, smaller national and regional capitalists and upper petty bourgeois types. That's, to a large degree, his base. And it's a base that isn't dependent upon traditional American political systems, which is why they don't trust him. He might do something crazy, even though he hasn't, even though he's gone along with the American imperialist system because he's an enthusiast for it. But because there's an increasing amount of tension between the lower layers of the American nationally based capitalist class and the upper layers of the financial capitalists, the people who own the big shares in all the major companies, the people who own the big shares in agribusiness, the people whose interests are represented by the Wall Street wealth management firms, the major banks, the major finance houses, the major hedge funds. Those people are often at loggerheads with the lower levels of the system, the lower down capitalists who regard the uppermost layers as operating in an unfair fashion, as always looking to screw them over or drive them out, that kind of thing. This is what is reflected. It's divisions within the capitalist class and the animus of the American petty bourgeois that's reflected in the Trump MAGA movement. And the MAGA movement also has similarities to, like, what you might call Little Englanderism in Britain, which is that, or you could call it Old Britannia enthusiasm. So, like, various different layers of the petty bourgeois in the United States that look back to, like, a cartoon version of the 1950s where many of them grew up. Because, of course, if you're a nostalgic, you never remember your own childhood accurately. Only a pessimist can remember his own childhood accurately. A nostalgic look at the 1950s and the New Deal era, and people tend to see in it what they want to see in it. You get nostalgia from the right and you get nostalgia from the left, which is essentially what the American left and right is dominated by, a nostalgia for a past that isn't real. So this battle, though, becomes more problematic for the American bourgeois, though, because the system's becoming more and more crisis-prone. Its legitimacy is collapsing. There's more conflict between the uppermost layers themselves. So, again, like, to use Lenin's old definition of what a pre-revolutionary situation is like, it's where the working class is no longer prepared to be ruled over in the old way. They can't live in that way, and the ruling class can no longer rule in the same old way. Both of the big classes in society need change. The middle layers are also in crisis. And so you have now the American ruling class fighting each other out in the open about the way forward. You have divisions between them over how to solve the crisis. You have those clustered around Biden, desperately clinging on to the Democratic Party, who want to just try to continue as they are, try and get out of the war in Ukraine without looking like you've lost, try and prepare for the war on China. You have others who are just interested in a war on China. You have all of them unified around the defense of Israel, but finding increasingly that brings them into conflict with many of their own voters, which further delegitimizes the system. But if they're not going all in to back Israel, then American dominance in the Middle East comes into question, therefore bringing into question the entirety of the American imperialist project. You see here how Trump and all the controversies that surround him is just a small part of a much bigger picture of an American imperialist system in a deep, deep crisis. The fact that they can't resolve what to do with him is just a small part of that. Now, they're going to try and it's now hardwired into the system that they have to try and get rid of Trump somehow. They can't have him back, they think. So lawfare him out, bar him from running, say that he organized a treacherous insurrection, all that kind of stuff. But again, even if they succeed, assume for a moment that one of the cases or some of the cases against Trump somehow result in him having to drop out. That doesn't solve anything for the system. What it will lead to is a big layer of the American population, particularly the petty bourgeois and the lower end capitalists, becoming even more angry at the upper end capitalists who they see as having screwed them over again. You will find more of these people getting directly involved in political organizations. Some of them will support openly reactionary movements, more openly fascist movements. Some, though, perhaps a minority, will become open to the ideas of communism. Now, that's a hard thing to imagine at the moment, but you're seeing the system in the United States and Britain decompose bit by bit by bit. So even people who are ferociously reactionary at some earlier stages of life, at earlier stages of a political struggle, when they see the bigger capitalists crush their chosen political projects, these people's minds will start to open to a certain degree. Now, as I said, the bulk of them will move in a reactionary direction for now. Some, a minority, will become open to the ideas of communism, though. And this is a product of a system in crisis. It's also why the system and the bourgeois are still so paranoid about communism. On one level, they understand the fact that their system is in a terminal crisis, that the legitimacy that's been built up inside bourgeois politics since World War II, based on the post-war concessionary period of the New Deal or the welfare state in Europe or Britain, all of that is coming to a close. The working class openly hates the system, ignores its propaganda, doesn't believe a word the politicians or the cultural influences or the newsmen say, and therefore the system tries to fight back. They try to delegitimize oppositional figures. They try to ban alternative sources of information. They throw insults at everybody who expresses any kind of opposition. They try to drive you out of polite society. All of this is going on at the moment. None of it is going to work because the material reality is that the system isn't working. Even for the layers in the labor aristocracy and the petty bourgeois that it used to work for, it's not working for them anymore. And so, again, the Trump crisis is but one manifestation of this enormous system-wide legitimacy crisis that is now facing American imperialism. And it is only a crisis that is going to get worse as time goes on. Even if they resolve the Trump question, even if they rule him out of running, all that will do is delegitimize the system even further. And therein lies the nature of the crisis. Everything that the bourgeois do now only exacerbates their problems. They try to get out of the 2008 economic crisis by flooding the system with liquidity. Now that's fundamentally compromising the stability of the system and the validity of their currency. They tried to get out of this crisis of 2008 by loading up the sanctions against Russia and trying to cause the Russian Federation to collapse. Now that's causing the American-led financial and trading system to implode because its legitimacy is gone. It's now regarded as too risky a bet by various powerful countries around the world that the US imperialists used to be allied with, like the Saudis, for instance. So you see that in a crisis, particularly in one that's deep and systemic as this one is, every move the bourgeois makes just makes the crisis worse, until you reach the point where you have a fundamental clash where the bourgeois is forced into a position where it has to do the old thing that Andrew Mellon said: liquidate capital, liquidate labor, liquidate stock, liquidate everything, annihilate value, annihilate capital, and annihilate labor in a real and physical sense, until you reach a point where the system can be profitable again. And that, of course, is the process by which you end up in a destructive inter-imperialist global war, which is what World War II was. But we're not quite at that stage yet, though we are accelerating down the road to it. Right. Okay. Yep, X, your comment. The establishment doesn't like Trump because he has no filter and sometimes tells the truth in his dumb tirades. Yes, that's also true. That's a factor. Luther92 says, people in England talk about Britain and not England, which makes no sense because Britain is not a coherent whole. I disagree with you completely. Britain's many things, but if I walk from one end of Britain to the other, there's a coherent nation there. Might not be a nation you particularly like, but it is a coherent nation. There are differences between the working class in England and Scotland and Wales, minor differences, but it's still a coherent British working class. And so dividing up the nations into England, Scotland and Wales and engaging in petty nationalism, whether it's English, Welsh or Scottish, is pointless. Yep, X says, do you think it's possible to have an economy without such companies as well as stock markets? Yes. It's the planned economy will operate without the giant corporations of our era, and whatever market does exist in the intermediate period will be one that is heavily controlled by a workers' state. Another tangent asks, Yep X, can you do a lengthy discussion of the World Economic Forum? I can, but the subject bores me. To be blunt, I've done it before. Look, in short, the World Economic Forum is one of many smoke-filled rooms that the bourgeois have, where, like the Bilderberg Group, like the Council on Foreign Relations, like numerous others that exist out there, that are essentially finishing schools and think tanks for bourgeois politicians to attend. That's why Keir Starmer, David Lammy are members of like Bilderberg. They go to the Bilderberg meetings. They go to the WEF meetings because these are influencing networks, finishing schools for certain politicians. I mean, that's why you get that fucking clown Javier Milei. He's a WEF guy along with Keir Starmer. Like, these are the places that the American ruling class and their associates set up to train these politicians in certain ways of behaving, certain policy outcomes that they want. They promote them through these think tank systems. So the WEF's just one of those. It got a lot of attention during COVID because it had a Bond villain at the head of it that was writing about how they were going to use the pandemic to do X, Y, and Z. But it's no more significant than Bilderberg or any of the others. These do form part of what I was describing, which is that after World War II, the bourgeois sought to set up various different ways in which that they would be able to decide upon things in smoke-filled rooms away from any public scrutiny. That's what the WEF is. That's what Bilderberg is. It's ways that the bourgeois can exercise their influence over political figures without being necessarily recorded in doing so. President Jesus says, I know you covered this before with Layla, but what do you think of Yanis Varoufakis' assertion that capitalism is dead? Has he addressed enough of the criticisms to lend his theory more legitimacy? I haven't read his latest thing, I will say, but Varoufakis is a fraud. He's a fraud because he has long peddled a version of pseudo-Trotskyism, and now he's going around saying that capitalism is dead, but he's being allowed to say that on the Times podcast. So, look, Varoufakis is a court jester. He's allowed out there by the bourgeois to push oppositional trends in certain directions. He's not a figure of any legitimacy or seriousness. Now, if there's people out there, if people want me to read and discuss his work, I'm happy to do so. But right up front, I would say that whatever he says has to be regarded with deep suspicion, because this guy was a government minister in the Greek government. I know he resigned before Tsipras did his final piece of treachery, but he was Tsipras's political ally for a long time. And he was part of that government that capitulated and destroyed opposition to the EU in Greece. So he bears a heavy responsibility. And he's also involved in various dubious networks funded by the German state and others that exist to derail people from finding out about communism. He's a pseudo-trot and not to be trusted, basically. Good afternoon to Kent in Minneapolis. Solidarity to Muzzle Paint. Gannibal says armed state agents, indeed. And Peter's ducking out, but we'll watch tomorrow. Okay. Right, that brings us to the close of what I wanted to talk about tonight. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. The audio version of this will be available on Patreon very soon. And we will be back again tomorrow with further discussions. I think the thing that needs to be discussed tomorrow will be the awful position of the British communists, and more to the point, the fake British communists in their latest editorial, which I'll post there in the chat. And if you're listening to this on Patreon, you can find it in the show notes. So thank you to everybody for tuning in. Feel free to add questions or comments. Be sure to subscribe on the Patreon, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the